The plantation owner believed he was arranging two futures, two marriages, two alliances, two perfectly controlled outcomes for his two perfectly identical daughters, Catherine and Elizabeth Caldwell, born minutes apart, raised the same way, dressed the same, taught to move through the world as if nothing could ever touch them, because nothing ever had. The Caldwell estate stood like a statement, white columns, wide verandas, land stretching further than most men could walk in a day. Inside, everything was ordered, predictable, structured, just like the future their father had already chosen for them. Respectable men, powerful families, marriages that would keep everything exactly as it was, exactly where it belonged. But what he didn't know was that his daughters had already stepped outside of that world. Not suddenly, not recklessly, quietly, over time. It began in places no one paid attention to. A book left open longer than it should have been. A conversation held just a moment too long. A question that should never have been asked. Because on a plantation like this, there were lines, clear, unspoken, unbreakable. Lines between who belonged and who was owned. And those lines were not meant to be crossed. Not by anyone. Especially not by them. Samuel worked near the far edge of the estate. Quiet, observant, careful with his words. He was known for his discipline, for the way he carried himself, for never drawing attention he didn't need. Elijah was different, stronger in presence, more direct, the kind of man people noticed, even when he said nothing. Both of them understood the rules, better than anyone, because their lives depended on it. And that was exactly why what happened next should have been impossible. It didn't happen all at once. There was no single moment, no sudden decision, just small shifts. A glance held too long, a conversation that didn't end when it should. Silence that meant something more than silence. Catherine noticed it first, not as danger, but as clarity. For the first time in her life, she was speaking to someone who did not treat her like something that had already been decided. Samuel never looked at her the way others did, not with expectation, not with calculation, just directly. Elizabeth's path was different, but it led to the same place. Elijah didn't soften his words, didn't lower himself, didn't pretend, and somehow that made everything clearer. Because for the first time, the world they had been raised in began to feel like something constructed, not natural, not permanent, something that only worked because everyone agreed not to question it, until someone did. The change wasn't visible at first, not to their father, not to the household. At the table, they still sat the same way, spoke when expected, smiled when required, played their roles perfectly. But inside, something had already shifted. Because once you see a system clearly, you can't unsee it. And once you understand the cost of staying inside it, you begin to measure everything differently. Time, choices, silence, even love. Their father began making arrangements in late summer. Quiet conversations, letters sent, names discussed. Men who would be suitable. Men who would strengthen the Caldwell name. Everything was moving forward, exactly as it should. Exactly as he intended. And that was the moment everything changed. Not outwardly, not yet, but in a way that could not be undone. Because Catherine and Elizabeth both understood something at the same time. If they stayed, they would lose more than freedom. They would lose the part of themselves that had already begun to... At first, nothing about it looked dangerous. That was the only reason it was allowed to exist. Because danger, on a place like this, is only recognized when it becomes visible. And this was not visible, not yet. It lived in the space between things, between instructions and disobedience, between silence and what silence was hiding. Catherine began asking questions she was never meant to ask, not loudly, not directly, carefully. Samuel answered the same way, not as a man trying to impress her, not as someone trying to gain favor, but as someone who had already learned that truth had to be measured before it was spoken. Their conversations stayed small at first. Work, weather, books, things that could not be used against either of them. But even those things began to change, because meaning doesn't come from words alone. It comes from who is allowed to speak them and who is not. Every sentence they exchanged crossed a line, even if no one else could see it. Elizabeth and Elijah were different. There was less hesitation, less distance, not because it was safer, but because neither of them pretended it was. Elijah did not lower his voice when he spoke, did not soften the truth, and Elizabeth did not turn away from it. Where Catherine moved with caution, Elizabeth moved with clarity, and Elijah met her there, not as something above him, not as something beyond him, but as someone standing directly in front of him. That alone was enough to change everything. Because the world they lived in was built on distance, carefully maintained distance, between who could speak and who had to listen, between who could choose and who was chosen. But in these moments, those distances disappeared. Not completely, not permanently, but enough. Enough to feel what the world was trying to prevent. It wasn't just affection. It wasn't just curiosity. It was recognition, the kind that cannot be undone once it happens. They began to understand each other in ways that had nothing to do with the roles assigned to them, nothing to do with status or expectation or ownership, only truth. And truth is dangerous when it appears in the wrong place. Because once it exists, it begins to change everything around it. How you see, how you think, how you measure what is right, and what is simply accepted. For Catherine, that change came quietly. She began noticing things she had never questioned before. The way instructions were given, the way silence was enforced, the way people avoided certain truths as if speaking them would break something. And she realized it already had. Elizabeth's realization came differently, faster, sharper. She didn't question the system, she rejected it. Not loudly, not publicly, but completely. Because once you see something clearly, you don't always need time to decide. Sometimes you already know. What neither of them said out loud was that this could not continue. Not like this. Not safely. Because the more they understood, the more impossible it became to pretend they did not. Every meeting carried risk now. Every conversation added weight, not just to themselves, but to the men they were speaking with. Samuel knew it. Elijah knew it. Better than anyone. Because the consequences would not be equal. Not even close. And yet, they didn't stop. Because by then, it was no longer about whether they should. It was about whether they could live without it. And the answer was already clear. Something had formed between them. Not fragile, not temporary, but something that did not belong in that world. And because of that, it could not stay. Which meant, sooner or later, one choice would have to be made. The decision did not arrive suddenly. It had been forming long before either of them named it. In every question that went unanswered. In every moment, they chose not to look away. But there comes a point when something that has been quietly growing can no longer remain hidden. That point came with a letter. Their father read it aloud at dinner, calm, controlled, certain. Names, families, arrangements already set in motion. 2 marriages, chosen carefully, approved quietly, expected completely. Catherine did not react. Elizabeth did not speak. They didn't need to, because the moment the words were spoken, they both understood the same thing. Time was over. There would be no more waiting, no more gradual change. Whatever existed between them was about to be erased. That night, the house returned to its usual silence. Doors closed, lights dimmed, routine restored. From the outside, nothing had changed. But inside, everything had. Catherine sat by the window long after the house had gone quiet. The land stretched out in darkness, familiar, ordered, unquestioned. But now she could see it differently. Not as something stable, but as something imposed. Elizabeth did not sit. She moved, slowly, deliberately, as if she had already stepped past hesitation. When she stopped, it wasn't in her own room. Catherine didn't turn. She didn't need to. Tonight? Elizabeth asked. The word carried everything. Risk, loss, finality. Catherine closed her eyes briefly. Then, yes. No argument, no hesitation. Because by then, the decision had already been made. Not in that moment, not in that room, but long before. The moment they understood, they could not stay. The plan had existed only as fragments until now, unspoken, incomplete. But once it became real, everything aligned quickly. What to take, what to leave, when to move. What could not be undone. They spoke very little, not because there was nothing to say, but because everything that mattered had already been understood. Somewhere else on the estate, Samuel was awake, not by accident. Elijah, too. Because this decision was never theirs alone. It belonged to all 4 of them, and all 4 understood the same truth. If they stayed, everything would be taken from them. Not slowly, not partially, completely. Not just each other, but the part of themselves that had already chosen something different. The risk was absolute. If they were seen, if they were stopped, the consequences would not be equal. They all knew that. Which is why the choice mattered even more. Because choosing this meant choosing it fully. No turning back, no correction, no explanation that would be accepted. Only movement. Only forward. Catherine stood. Elizabeth was already at the door. They did not look at each other. Not because they didn't need to, but because looking would make it real in a different way. And if they allowed themselves that moment, they might hesitate. And hesitation was no longer an option. Outside, the night stretched wide and empty. The kind of silence that hides movement. The kind of darkness that makes things disappear. Exactly what they needed. Exactly what they had been waiting for. Somewhere beyond the house, 2 other figures were already moving. Careful, measured, ready. And for the first time, all 4 paths began to align. Not by chance, not by impulse, but by choice. A choice that would erase everything they had been given and replace it with something unknown, something dangerous, something real. And by the time the house woke the next morning, that choice would already be impossible to undo. The house did not wake immediately. That was the first advantage. On a place built on routine, there is always a window between what is expected and what is actually happening. They moved inside that window, quietly, precisely. No doors slammed, no hurried movements. Because urgency makes noise, and noise ends everything. Catherine stepped into the hallway first. The same hallway she had walked her entire life. Measured, predictable, safe. Tonight, it felt different. Not because it had changed, but because she had. Elizabeth followed. Not behind, not leading. Aligned. Like they had always been, but now, for the first time, moving towards something instead of waiting for it. Outside, the darkness held everything in place. The fields, the trees, the paths that no one noticed during the day. Samuel was already there, still, watching, listening. Not for sound, but for the absence of it. Elijah stood further back, closer to the tree line, positioned where the shadows were deeper, where movement disappeared faster. They had thought about this more than once. Every step, every distance, every second that mattered. Because this wasn't escape in the way people imagine. Not running blindly into the dark. Not chaos. Not desperation. This was control. The kind of control they had never been allowed before. The door opened, slowly, then closed again. No signal, no words. None were needed. For a moment, all four of them stood still. Not out of hesitation, but because this was the last point, where everything still existed as it had before. The last moment before it disappeared. Then they moved. Not toward the road, not toward the obvious paths. Those were watched, expected. Instead, they moved across the edge of the land, where boundaries blurred, where ownership was less visible, where the system began to lose its shape. Behind them, the house remained still, untouched, unaware, exactly as they needed it to be, for now. Time stretched differently in the dark. Seconds felt longer. Distances felt uncertain. But they kept moving. Not faster, not slower. Consistent. Because panic breaks patterns, and patterns are what let you disappear. Somewhere in the distance, something shifted. A sound. Small. Unclear. All four stopped, instantly. No words. No reaction. Just stillness. Then nothing. The night closed back in, and they moved again. Deeper this time. Further from anything that could recognize them. What they were leaving behind was not just a place. It was a structure. A system that defined everything. Names, roles, value. And with every step, those definitions weakened. Not gone yet, but no longer absolute. By the time the first light touched the horizon, they were no longer where they had been. No longer within reach of immediate return. No longer visible inside the world they had left. And that is when the second part began. Not escape, but disappearance. Because what happens next is not about getting away. It's about making sure no one can ever bring you back. Back at the house, the day started exactly as expected. Servants moved, doors opened, the rhythm returned. Until it didn't. A room left untouched, a bed that had not been slept in, then another, and another. Voices, questions, confusion. Not panic yet, not fully, because at first, it doesn't make sense. Things like this don't happen. Not here, not like this, not to them. But as the minutes pass, the truth begins to form. Incomplete, unstable, but impossible to ignore. They are gone. Not misplaced, not delayed. Gone. And the only explanation the world can accept is the one that protects it. Taken, abducted, stolen in the night. Because the alternative, that they chose this, cannot be allowed to exist. So the story is decided, before the truth is even considered. Written, repeated, believed. And from that moment forward, the South does not search for 4 people who left. It searches for something that was taken, which is exactly what they needed. Because the less the truth is believed, the easier it is to disappear. For years, nothing changed. At least, not in the way the South chose to remember it. The story remained the same, repeated, reinforced. 2 daughters, taken in the night, victims of something outside the system, something that could be blamed without ever questioning what existed inside it. Because that version of the story was easier. Easier than admitting that they had walked away. But somewhere far from that land, the truth continued. Quietly, without witnesses, without records that anyone intended to preserve. New names, new routines, new lives built carefully from what had not been taken. Not free from risk, not free from memory, but no longer defined by what they had been told they were. Catherine and Elizabeth did not speak of the past often, not because they forgot, but because remembering it did not change what they had chosen. Samuel and Elijah worked, built, adapted, not as shadows within a system, but as men who could finally decide how to move through the world. It wasn't easy. Nothing about it was. Every step forward carried the weight of what had been left behind. But it was theirs, for the first time. Years passed, then more, and eventually, the past began to feel distant enough to be approached again. Not to return to it, but to see what remained. One of them went back, not to reclaim anything, not to be recognized, but to understand how the story had been told. The land was the same, the house still stood, the structure unchanged, but the narrative was fixed. They had been taken. There was no mention of choice, no acknowledgement of will, no room for truth. And that is when something became clear. Not just about what had happened, but about how history survives. Not as it is, but as it is allowed to be remembered. The truth had never disappeared. It had simply been replaced. Because a world built on control cannot allow the idea that people can walk away from it. So the record remained untouched, unchallenged, accepted, and they did not correct it. Not publicly, not officially, because correcting it would mean stepping back into a world they had already left, a world that would not accept the truth, even if it was spoken. So they let it stand. The lie, protecting the system that created it. And their truth existing quietly beyond its reach. In the end, what mattered was not what the world believed, not the version written down, not the story repeated, but the fact that on one night, 4 people made a choice that could not be undone. A choice that erased everything expected of them and replaced it with something uncertain, something dangerous, something real. They were not taken. They were not lost. They left. And that difference is something history rarely allows. Because if one person can walk away, then anyone can. And if that becomes true, the system itself begins to fall apart. So the story remained buried, not because it was gone, but because it was too dangerous to be believed.